security testing at high velocity, keeping up with the Agile and DevOps. And this is being brought to you by Hewlett Packard Enterprise. So hey to everyone, my name is Richard Howe. I am the Sales Account Manager for Results Positive. Results Positive, we're a Platinum partner with HPE, and we specialize in application security. Today's speaker is Cindy Blake. Cindy is the Product Marketing Manager for Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Cindy works with customers and account teams around the globe to help them apply application security tools to mature their application security posture and reduce risk. She also specializes in focusing on runtime application self-protection. She also helps customers integrate security as they shift toward a DevOps methodology. So before we get started, just some housekeeping. Today's live session is being intended for all Vivid members. The recording will be posted in the webinar section on the Vivid website. It will be visible for all members. Additionally, today's slide deck and webinar recording will be made available to you. We will send you the link via email once they are posted to the Vivid website. To enlarge the presentation panel on your screen, just click on the rectangle in the upper right-hand corner of the presentation pane being pointed to you by the red arrow. If you have any questions as we go, please type and send them in the Q&A panel on the left side of the screen. Simply type in your question and click on the Ask button. To ask a question and receive them in your native language, click on the flag in the upper left corner of your screen, which will launch a language selector box. Next, click on the radio button next to your language, and then click on Apply, and you are all set. Okay, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Cindy.
Great, thank you. And good morning, everyone. I appreciate your time and your interest in this topic. So let's get started. Let me show you the agenda here, what we're going to cover in the next bit. I want to first level set on the DevOps challenges for security, make sure that we're all on the same page and looking at the problem. Application security at each phase in the software development lifecycle. So if we're in development, in test, and in production. And then lastly, we're going to look at some practical advice, how you can make application security testing more efficient and more effective. But before we do that, I want to do a couple of polling questions and just understand where the audience is coming from here. So I'm going to send that back to Richard then for the polling, if you don't mind.
So to everyone, again, we're going to take a couple of polling questions. The first question is, what percentage of your application portfolio is being developed in-house? That is the first question. So you guys should see that, and if you can vote on that. Give it here a few minutes for everyone.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty much what I would expect. You know, in a perfect world, you'd probably want no custom development except that which is really core to your business and a key differentiator for you. But
yep. Yeah. So to the audience, it looks like we've got 5 individuals that answered 0 to 25%. 8 individuals voted for 25 to 75%. And 1 individual voted from 75 to 100%. Okay, let's go to the next question. Again, we're going to vote on this one as well. What percentage of your in-house portfolio uses a DevOps methodology? Again, what percentage of your in-house portfolio uses a DevOps methodology? Okay, so it looks like the majority of the folks voted for the 0 to 25%. Okay.
And Richard, this is in keeping with the findings from our security and DevOps research. the vast majority of folks are just getting their toe in. So if you feel like you're behind because you're not doing enough around DevOps, you're really not. Everybody's in the same boat. Everybody's either in early stages or maybe they've taken a couple of applications and really pushed them, but it's a very small portion of their portfolio.
Great. Good. All right. So we've got one more question. Again, we're going to vote on this one. Number 3, have you integrated application security testing into your overall test automation? So we'll take a few minutes. We'll vote on this one.
Yeah, it's looking here like the results are similar. It doesn't surprise me that there's a lot of folks that are not sure. When you think about all of the silos of roles and responsibilities, it's not surprising that you, depending upon where you sit in the organization, you may not be aware of what application security testing is being done. Now, the no, there's quite a few, I think the majority of folks say no, they're not. And that is in keeping with findings as well, although I'm going to show you some more details of our security research there because that's something that you really need to work on. Okay, should we move on?
Yes.
All righty. So level setting here. Now, you know, DevOps is a loaded word, right? It's very similar to cloud was years ago. Everybody applied a different meaning to it. Everybody was executing it differently, and it was much more of an art than a science. And that's, you know, that's really where we are with DevOps at the moment. But at its core, it brings together development and operations to and leverages automation to deploy software, and if you think about it, therefore, your business capabilities that depend on that software, faster and with higher quality. So that's really what we're talking about at its core. And when you look at characteristics, key characteristics of a shop that is practicing DevOps, what we found is that, you know, merely integrating the team, so having dev and ops people work together more closely was actually one of the chief places where people were starting. And then automating the testing, you know, there's lots of testing that goes on in addition to security testing, load performance, integration, all those kinds of things. And automating all of that is key. Now you see application security testing automation is much lower, so that's really more of something that people are starting to do, but it's not as well entrenched. And then, of course, continuous integration and continuous deployment make up a big part of what we're looking at in DevOps as well. If you think about how DevOps is different than traditional development methodologies, the biggest difference, quite frankly, is the release frequency. So moving from a release every year, every 6 months, to monthly, weekly, daily, even some organizations are even between, but today. The other piece is the automation and the ability to, you know, to automate the testing and to have shared accountability. So it really becomes much more of a team effort instead of you know, development creates the code, throws it over the wall, and ops spins up environments and you know, may or may not be what dev needs and all of that. So it becomes much more of a shared process. Now, when we look at security and how security plays into DevOps, this is an important context item here. If you're not familiar with application security, you may not have ever seen this, but it's really similar to Lean Six Sigma and the idea that if you can eliminate defects early, it's going to be less costly and more effective. And so just in the same vein, if you can eliminate the security defects early, it's going to save you all the downstream effort to track and retest and validate those findings. So that becomes really key, because when we did this research, it was we published it in September of 2016, and I think the links that you'll get have the links to the Secure DevOps research in there. But what we found is that most people are still focused very late in the software development lifecycle with a pre-production gate, which is a very traditional approach as opposed to more DevOps-oriented approach. So what we find is, almost everyone surveyed said, yeah, DevOps is an opportunity to improve application security, but when you look at what they're actually doing, their behavior hasn't caught up to that expectation yet. A really shocking thing here was that 17% of those that we surveyed said that they had no application security whatsoever, relying on network security to protect their applications. And that's really important, because there's a whole discussion on network security versus application security, but there's certain things that AppSec can see that network security just cannot. So that's one key part of that. The other is, and we actually found this through doing research and interviews, a lot of people misunderstand what application security even is. So another key context here is that it's not just about protecting the code to keep the hackers from actually changing the code. Now, a lot of people felt like, I have access control, a hacker can't touch my code, so they're good. But that's really not it. What we're talking about is keeping your application from being tricked into malicious behavior, like divulging sensitive data or injecting malicious logic, and so it behaves in a way that you don't expect, or that could cause harm. So think about things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection. There's a whole long list of other things. I know those two tend to get the most attention. But in fact, there's an OWASP top 10 that'll give you a list of the top 10 application security threats. And we actually look for a lot more than that. But that's really important to understand. What we're talking about with application security is, as your application interacts with users on the web or in an infrastructure, you want to make sure that it's not being hijacked, basically, to do some things that you didn't expect. So with that context, let's look at, how do you integrate application security into your software development lifecycle? And we're going to look at the lifecycle, so development, testing, and production. And we're going to talk a lot more about the testing side of this, just because we want to talk about best practices and how to shorten that cycle and that sort of thing. But I think it's really important that you understand the entire scope, the full spectrum of the life cycle. So we're going to look at how to integrate application security into your development methodology. It really can't be bolted on. It needs to be part of the natural workflow if it's going to get used. So let's start with development here. So what can you do in development? Well, developers really, they're not intended to be security experts. Their fundamental goals are very different. And, they need to create good code that meets business objectives, that's bug-free. Now, you really should consider security vulnerabilities as just another kind of bug, because they can have even more far-reaching consequences. And so the best way to treat security vulnerabilities or as bugs is to avoid creating them in the first place. So let's look at how you can do that. I mean, one way is you can train developers to become more security-minded, but they're not security experts. Security experts and expertise is very difficult to find and very difficult to retain. And so if you did train them, they'd just leave and go become a security expert somewhere else. So it's not just about teaching them. It's about having tools in place that can help them identify vulnerable code. And ideally, you'd want to do that as they're writing the code. That's the most efficient and effective time to do that. So we have a feature called the Fortify Security Assistant. It's a feature of our static code analysis that it functions sort of like something. Spell check will underline something that is not spelled correctly, and it'll pop up with some suggestions. Well, this would function very similar. There functions very similar to that. So as they're writing the code, and let me show you a screenshot here. A little small maybe, but as they're actually writing the code, it comes up with what is the vulnerability, the level of criticality, and some remediation advice on how to fix it. So the key here really is that it's within the IDE. So you're not asking the customer, you're not asking the developer to change their workflow or to leave their development environment and go somewhere else. You're actually integrating it into their natural workflow. And if they see this and they see that they're doing the same thing a couple of times, and they see it pop up with the same thing, kind of like I can never spell separate, but I've misspelled it enough that now I know how to spell it because spell check kind of taught me. It's the same kind of thing here. I see that pop up, and the next time I'm going to be more efficient because I'm not going to create that error in the first place. Now, when we look at testing, so even though we want to eliminate as many vulnerabilities in development as we can, that's not always possible for lots of different reasons. And it's still very important that you do security testing. So there's two parts here really to this thought. One is around the automation of the application security testing, and the other is around integration. So let's look first at automation, and then we'll come back to the integration. Into how to do it better, we need to first look at, how is application security testing done today, and how do you build it in? So the first piece of this is giving tools to a developer that, like we talked about, to help them avoid creating the vulnerabilities to begin with. But as the code comes together in a build, you want to do static testing, and that looks at the code itself to see if there's something about the way it was written that creates a vulnerability. And then once you have when you're going through tests, test QA, you've got a working application. That's where you would apply dynamic testing. So it uses a working application to run through and see what vulnerabilities are created by some of the flows within that. And then, lastly, you've got a decision to go or no go, and whether to stop the build or move into production. And this all becomes iterative in a DevOps environment and sort of condensed, so faster, shorter cycles here. But in the end, a lot of it's still the same in terms of what needs to be done, and then you can just look at how to build it in using tools and automation to help accelerate that. So we're going to focus, though, for the next couple of minutes, more around the static analysis and dynamic analysis. And let me jump here to another slide here. I've got quite a bit of discussion on that, so I'm going to come back to the static analysis, and I'm going to jump now to the production side of the software development lifecycle. So think about, there's lots of reasons why you could have vulnerabilities in production. Some of it may be from your own code, and it may be a conscious those into production. Could also be that it's not your code, or it's legacy code that's very fragile and you're afraid to change it. It could be third-party code, though, where you're at the mercy of the vendor to fix it. So there are ways that you can virtually patch that in a production environment, and you can use Application Defender and RAST to do that. So let me explain what I mean here. If you're not familiar with RASP and that term, this is Runtime Application Self-Protection. It's a segment of application security that's somewhat new. It's been around for, we were first to market, I think, about 7 years ago. So it's relatively new compared to static and dynamic testing. And it instruments the application in the runtime environment to see the actual behavior, what's really going on. So some of our DevOps customers are using RASP and Application Defender, which is our offering of RASP, in this way. And so they'll do their vulnerability testing with their static and dynamic testing in pre-production and find vulnerabilities. And then rather than taking the time to fix them at that point and delaying the deployment, they go ahead and deploy with those security flaws and put that in for future remediation on a future sprint. But they don't just stop there and assume that risk. They will use Application Defender to monitor and even protect those vulnerabilities. So it can watch for exploits against those vulnerabilities and flag them, and it can flag within the tool itself, or it can flag your Security Operations Center, your SOC. Can do both if you want. That it can actually protect those vulnerabilities. So it can, if you know you've got a risk for SQL injection, you know you've got a specific vulnerability for it, why not let that tool protect that until you can go back and remediate it more fully. So that's how our customers are using Application Defender. Just one more note about it. It has two parts. It can do logging, and even for applications that were not developed and you're written to create logs, so you can monitor an application's behavior if you'd like, or go back and research it if you have a problem. And then it has protection rules as well. So that's the part that where it can take action and actually stop an attack for you. So there's lots of reasons why you might need that compensating control. I mentioned there's lots of reasons you can have vulnerabilities in production, but it can also be, I've got too many vulnerabilities. I found too many in my security testing. I can't possibly fix them all before I need to get this application live. It could also be I found some and I can't fix it in the time frame required. We see that with audits. I'm given 30 days. I'm going to come back and re-audit you in 30 days. Well, that vulnerability is going to take longer to fix than the time that I have. Or in the case of DevOps, where, I just don't want to slow down my deployment, and I'll go back and fix it later. So there's lots of times when a compensating control becomes quite handy. Let me talk about how you can integrate all of these tools into your DevOps tool chain. Now, I mentioned the research that we did, and we asked folks we went through the software development lifecycle, and we said, what tools do you use at each stage? And we ended up with more our interviews, and I think there's a real sense of tool fatigue. So the key here really is about integrating application security with your unique set of tools that your enterprise is using and building it into the workflow so that it really becomes one seamless, cohesive process. And so we've recognized this challenge, and we want to help. And the way that we've done this is we've put all of the technologies to do this integration, to integrate Fortify application security into your DevOps tool chain into one place. And it functions sort of like a marketplace, only it's free. We've got plugins and APIs and chef recipes and all that kind of good stuff in one place with the goal to embed application security into your unique and natural workflow. And that's really important to having a successful application security program as part of your DevOps. So let's dig a little bit deeper. I mentioned we're going to spend more time on static and dynamic, particularly static for this audience. And so I want to dig down into application security and how you can be more efficient and more effective at it. So first, let's make sure that everyone understands static and dynamic analysis and what it is. So static analysis or static application security testing, it's also known as SAST. You may hear these as SAST and DAS, static application security testing, dynamic application security testing. But static focuses on the source code or the bytecode or binary code, depending upon the vendor that you use, whereas dynamic needs that running application. You provide a URL and the tool, goes and crawls it. And each of these finds things that the other one may not. So it's really important that you do both. Now let's walk through, I'm going to do a little bit of a build here. Let's level set on the static analysis process and how it fits within the development environment. I understand there's a lot of folks from the development side of the house on the call, and so I want to make sure that that you have a picture of the security perspective here. So the first piece is that, and let's see if my build's working. You've got you've got some code. You check it in. You're doing your Scrum teams, and you've got a piece of finished code. Then you check it into the code repository. You schedule it for continuous integration, so your build process, and you can automate then that piece that includes the testing for your static analysis. And so that information can automatically be sent to Fortify for your static analysis. And that information then gets stored, and it goes to two places. It can go to AppSec, and it should go to your bug tracking as well, so that the developers get one perspective of the bugs, and the bugs include security bugs. But then also we can provide more details to the developers that gives a little bit more information about where the problem is. If you're doing, this is another difference between network-based security and application security. Web application firewall, for instance, it'll tell you you've got a problem here, a vulnerability, and it'll even protect it, but it just tells you that which application. It's not going to give you a lot of detail. So by instrumenting with RASP and Application Defender, you can actually get line of code and stack traces, so it's much more efficient for the developer, so they're not wasting a lot of time trying to find where the problem is. They can just focus on fixing it. And so this is the, rinse and repeat, right? So this becomes a very iterative process as the development piece of this until you get to the point of actual working application, and then you can focus on dynamic testing as well. And this has many challenges with it. So let's look at the challenges for static analysis. I would really put into three main buckets. So scale, complexity, and security expertise. So you don't want to waste a lot of time focusing on fretting over, tracking, assigning, fixing findings that are not important. And frankly, the tools by themselves are going to find things that may not be important to you. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a false positive. It still is a vulnerability, but it may be less important to you. So there's a bit of a flow here in terms of finding all the things that could be an issue, and then focusing on the things that are an issue to you, and then looking at those things that are of most importance to you. So that's a real big piece of this. You know, with that volume of findings, somebody needs to validate them. A mixture of that, which is most effective, by the way. And then once you decide which ones are most important to you, you really need to go back and fix them. You know, it's amazing to me in talking to people, they spend so much time finding vulnerabilities, and some shops spend very little time actually fixing them. What good is it to know where the problem that you have these vulnerabilities, and some of them may be critical, if you never go back and remediate them? So that remediation can be a big challenge. We've had customers that do scans and they find 10,000 vulnerabilities. Well, gosh, you know, they kind of throw up their hands, and how am I ever in my lifetime going to fix 10,000 vulnerabilities? That's where the security expertise comes in handy in terms of helping identify the ones that are the most critical and focusing on those. And we really wouldn't recommend that you bite off the whole elephant, either in findings or in remediation. So start with a targeted list of vulnerabilities, whether it's, you know, cross-site scripting and SQL injection, since those tend to be some of the most damaging. And, you know, you can focus on those and begin to look for other kinds of vulnerabilities as you get a process down for dealing with the vulnerabilities that you find. The other thing to mention here is using RAFs, like we just talked about, to actually protect those vulnerabilities until you can remediate on your own time. So that's going to give you some control back where it may not be practical for you to do the remediation at this very moment, but maybe, you know, in 6 months you've got plans to rewrite that whole section, and that would make more sense to do it then. Now, lengthy scans can be a problem. The way to solve that, but actually, there's a very consistent correlation between the hardware and the time to do the scan. So if the scan is too slow, add more cores or processors, or do it in the cloud, which we'll talk about the cloud here in a little bit, because that is a way to get all of this done much more quickly. You can also, do less frequent scans, so you're only focusing on when you have meaningful code changes. You can break up large applications into smaller chunks. You can do that lightweight scanning that we talked about at the developer's IDE. That's going to save you from having to do more here. So those are good considerations. And then on communication, in terms of efficiency, I mentioned the security bug is just like any other bug, really. It really should be part of your bug tracking solution, but don't submit findings that haven't been audited and confirmed or validated, because you could just end up having to undo a lot of effort, or you could have avoided a lot of effort there. And we really don't recommend that you break a build for unvalidated findings. So you need to do some validation. We'll walk through a little bit on how you can do that. When we look at, I've got metrics on here too, when you think about metrics and communication to leadership, positive trending metrics really make adoption easier. So if you can find, I've decreased the number of vulnerabilities, that goes a long way towards showing progress, even if you haven't bitten off that whole elephant and tried to get to zero defects. The other is oftentimes applications now are not just one chunk of code written by one developer. So they're modular. They may call open source code. They may have microservices, that sort of thing. So all of that complicates efforts, but it doesn't make it impossible. Now, our guys will tell you that have done auditing in the past, if this becomes too complicated, centralizing that scanning may actually simplify the efforts. Oops, I did not mean to hit that. Go back. So, and then judgment and expertise. So, like I said, you find a bunch of vulnerabilities. What's important to you may not be important to me, and it all comes down to you have a different kind of business, you have a different appetite for risk, and so there has to be some judgment applied, even when you're doing a managed service provider. So they're real good at finding, at finding those results and at removing false positives, but they're not real good at removing what your organization doesn't care about because of your own unique set of, of circumstances. So you still really need to have some level of oversight into this, which just, it just shows that this is application security can be a little bit challenging. Let me walk through a little bit of an example here. So think about that process that I showed you as one application. So I've got my source code, I do my static analysis, I get all this bucket of results. I need to apply some, and you can use, there's third-party risk, I'm missing the word here, but risk frameworks. There's other structures like OAuth that help you prioritize. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's lots of resources that you can draw on there to help you with this prioritization, but you need to decide for you what's critical and what's not. Now, oftentimes the security guy gets here stuck in the middle of cleaning up the mess and the triage, but there are lots of legitimate reasons why some of the findings may not really be issues. I know this is a little bit hard to read, but it may not be exploitable. It might be noise. It might, just be a policy issue. It might be something that you're comfortable with. There's all kinds of reasons that that you wouldn't want to focus on creating exception paperwork and going through the motions for things that are ultimately unimportant and a waste of time. Now, if you have a good application security program, it should help you focus on those real issues where you're not throwing up a bunch of things from a scan and having to sort them out. So it can really help the developers when you have a good application security program and you're focusing on only those things that are important, so they're not chasing a bunch of remediation unnecessarily. So if you use something like the Audit Assistant feature, so we come up with the vulnerabilities, but we have this Audit Assistant feature that helps you prioritize, and it uses machine learning to focus on what's important and critical to you. And it does this by learning from past scans. Every time you scan the things that are unimportant to you, it learns the next time that that's unimportant to you. And so it really begins to tailor the program for your unique environment. So how does this help you? It can make the auditing process so much easier and more efficient. It can increase the relevancy and consistency of the findings. So you're not reinventing the wheel every time, and you're dealing with this, problems in the same manner each time. You can identify vulnerabilities earlier in the SDLC, as we've talked about. That's much more efficient and effective, and that's going to help you scale. Now, we'll talk for just a moment about dynamic. Dynamic is probably not as interesting to this group. Dynamic requires that you have running code. And so I mentioned typically that would be a web application. You give it the URL, and the tool will, whatever dynamic analysis tool you're using, will walk through each of the logic flows to identify vulnerabilities. Now, some of the challenges, that can take a long time depending on the application, particularly if you've got one of these monster applications that, is not easily modularized to do sections of it. The scan can take a long time. Now, you can, again, throw hardware at it to make your scans go faster. So the other thing is, now we can all say that test absolutely always mirrors production, but it usually doesn't. And oftentimes you need to focus on having that more robust test environment and test data actually to really security tests on the dynamic side. Another thing here is persistent, the possibility of some persistent damage. You could test everything, and you could test the delete user button, for instance. So you kind of have to apply some common sense in terms of what you're testing, and that's why a manual intervention may be necessary in some circumstances. Most, I think there's a question about dynamic analysis more effective than pen testing, so I'll answer that here. Most people still use pen testing occasionally, but you can use it less frequently and they'll have less findings. But the reason why you would use it less frequently, manual pen testing, is because you've taken the time to do the rigor of building it in as part of your test automation. Okay, let's see. Keep losing that next button. So the recommendations that we would suggest, how can you apply what you've learned here today? If your head is swimming over the application security stuff, call a Fortify expert and do an assessment of your own situation. They'll look at your what applications you have, what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve, your priorities, and help you come up with an application security program. If you're more of a DIY kind of person, do it yourself, and let's say either you have Fortify or you have some other tools, application security tools, and you want to understand how to better apply them, we have some workshops. We're doing these regionally across the U.S. In 2017, and the link should be included in the shop, and understand how to better leverage the investment that you've made with Fortify, or to see how you can apply it more in your unique environment. And then, if you're short on AppSec expertise or security expertise in general, the other way is doing this in the cloud. So the products and the features and stuff that we've talked about, except for the part that actually sits in the IDE, because that's your, needs to be there with your developer. But everything else can be done in the cloud. And so you can upload your source code. We scan it. We give it back to you, and we deliver the results with remediation advice. And you even get a person, an actual live person that you can call to help if you need to help interpreting the remediation advice or understanding how to fix the problem. So just a bit more on Fortify On Demand. It's really a good place to start if you haven't started application security. For those 17% of the people out there that are not using AppSec at all, or the additional 25% that are relying on network security, the Fortify On Demand will give you, get you started very quickly and give you some results right away. In a DevOps environment, you've got a turnaround time, too, that you can count on, and we can work with you to get that where you need it, based on how large your application is. And so it's really a good way to start interjecting application security into your DevOps methodology and your processes. And then I've got to brag on Fortify here for just a minute, because the Gartner Magic Quadrant results are due out any day here, and I'm real excited. all of the major application security testing methods, tools, segments, SAST, DAST, IAST, which is Integrated Application Security Testing, and RAST. I've talked about the other three. We have been, in fact, in the leader quadrant every year since its inception. So we're proven, and we've been out there, and we are available both on-premise and on-demand to meet whatever need that you have. So I think our customers sort of speak for loads for our capabilities here, but do watch for that next magic quadrant to come out here shortly. So with that, let me move to questions. And Richard, do you want to jump in here on some of the questions?
Sure. Thanks a lot, Cindy. So the first question I have, do you recommend using both SAST and DST, or do we really need one or the other, is the first question.
Yeah, they each solve a different problem, and they're each going to find different kinds of vulnerabilities. So we really recommend that you use both static and dynamic, static being the code, dynamic being the working application. And in fact, if you've got some time for some interesting reading, Google Jason Schmidt and Dark Reading. He and the Contrast CEO got into quite a debate over, when you only have one to offer, then you're going to be really passionate that that's the one. And so the fact that we have all of the application security segments covered, we're not trying to sell you a one-trick pony. We'll be square with what you need for your situation. And so it makes it.
Okay. So second question we have is, what about IAST? Do you recommend using IAST?
I do, in fact, and you may read more about this a little bit too. I've got a slide here on IAST, since I didn't include any IAST integrated or interactive application security testing in the conversation or in the presentation. IAST is a combination of dynamic testing and the RAST agent that instruments the application, and it's going to give you even better, faster results than if you're using dynamic alone. So the really cool thing here that we haven't done a good job of marketing, that most people don't realize, is if you are a dynamic scanning customer of ours, so if you have Weblnspect, which is our dynamic scanning tool, you get that agent for free. So you've basically got IAST and DAST for just the price of DAST, and we tend to not talk about it. But if you've got it, give it a try.
Okay. Next question. Do we have Fortify plugins for Visual Studio?
Yes, we do. If you go to, the website's going to be provided here in the end, but hpe.com/software/Fortify ecosystem. That is where the marketplace is, and we have plugins for Visual Studio. Now, you may be asking if that security assistant works with Visual Studio. The first, I believe it's just so is next on the plan, and I could not begin to tell you the time frame of that. It may already be out there, but for that security assistant. But always check that Fortify ecosystem. That's where you're going to find all of the latest and greatest there.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So the next question we have is, what is the difference between Security Assistant and SCA Scan and IDE?
Security Assistant and SCA Scan and IDE. So Security Assistant is a feature of our static analysis. And if you have if you have our static code analyzer, SCA, then you already have Security Assistant. That's part of SCA. So you may have it and not realize that you have it. The other thing is we have pulled out that feature and put it into a more standalone tool called Weblnspect. And the idea is two things. One is maybe you don't have an overall application security program, so you're not as interested in pulling all of the results from all of your developers together into one picture. You just want to just get me started, right? Just give me some basics for a developer. Weblnspect is just that standalone workbench piece, and it has the security assistant on it to help you get started. Now, ultimately, as you grow and mature an application security program, you're going to want, to really understand how you're progressing and how, who's working on what vulnerabilities and that sort of thing. And then, so you can take the results from Weblnspect and plug them into the Software Security Center, which is our overall dashboard system, along with a more complete picture. So think about it as, we've pulled out a subset from SCA to help you get started if you need to. If you want the full beast, you've got SCA, and that includes Security Assistant. And I think, let's see, we answered that. We answered the pen testing question.
Correct. And so the next question was, does Fortify On Demand log bugs or defects directly into the ALM Quality Center application?
When you say directly, there's yes, there is an interface available there, and in fact, I think we also have an interface with Bugzilla and a couple others. So, again, if you check that Fortify ecosystem, you can see if there's any technology required to make that integration happen, it would be there. That's definitely a key part here. Now, I will say the one thing, it's not a two-way street. So we send bug information to the bug tracking tools, but we don't get information back from them right now on what's been fixed. So you really, if you're going to send it to your bug tracking, you'd really use your bug tracking tool to be your picture of what's going on and what needs to be, what's been fixed.
Okay. Next question was regarding ASP. What does it represent? I think this represents runtime application security protection, if I'm correct.
Runtime application self-protection.
Okay, self-protection, that's what she actually asked. Okay, so I was wrong. So Thank you so much for clarification. Next question is, why is the IDE scan lightweight compared to SCA scan on server?
Yeah, it's really just intended to be a lightweight standalone workbench. So beyond that, in terms of understanding the nuances, I would say contact your Fortify rep for the details on that, or I can get back to you. But it is a subset of the overall SCA capabilities that they're now. If you're okay, I may be confusing things here. If you're talking about Weblnspect, it's a subset. If you're talking about using SCA within your IDE, you're getting the full SCA. It's not a subset. It's not necessarily lightweight. Your SCA has that security assistant feature. Right, let's see. When should DAST start in the SDLC? So DAST is dynamic application security testing. DAST starts in the SDLC when you have a working application. So it doesn't look at the code itself. So you really have to have a running app. But as soon as you have a running app or even a running module, you can start your dynamic testing. Is a tool for developers. It can be. It's usually it's more often used in tests and QA, but again, thinking about the whole DevOps movement of earlier is better. I would say, if you're focusing on your automation and integrating it into your DevOps tool chain, as soon as you've got a working piece of code from your build, that would be where you would apply the dynamic testing.
I think we've got one more question at that. What was the name of the article that by Jason Smith?
It actually wasn't an article. It was more of a conversation. And get it over to the Vivid folks. But if you Google it, it was between Jason and Contrast Security, and they were kind of going back and forth on whether you need to have. See, Contrast only focuses on IAST and RAST and that end of things. So that's where they're going to say you need the dynamic piece of it, not the static. But they're a little biased in their opinion.
Okay. So this is all the questions we have here in the chat. So anyone, is there any additional questions you guys want to submit? If not, is there anything else that you want to conclude in the presentation?
No, thank you very much, and look for the links to the research paper and some of the other things that I provided.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. If you have a chance, if you can complete the short survey, you should see this pop up. This is kind of get some feedback on the presentation, and we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.